All right, this is chapter 9, the underpinnings of agriculture. There is a lot in this chapter. I'm going to go through it kind of fast. So if you need more explanation on anything that I go over, you can ask me in class. The case study is about bees. You should read this. There's a lot of interesting work and research going on right now regarding bees and pollination. So it's definitely worth reading. Then we turn the page. Section 9.1 is about resources and service in agriculture. There's a lot here. So first I want to talk about the idea of what is agriculture. 10,000 years ago, humans switched from being hunter-gatherers to an agricultural society. And this caused a positive feedback loop for exponential population growth. The reason for that is when you're a hunter-gatherer, you move from place to place, following the food, and you have to carry all of your stuff and all of your children with you. And so they actually spaced out their children and didn't have that many. But when you move to a farm, you actually need help on the farm, so it's good to have more children. And so farming led to people having more and more children to work on the farm, and they were able to support them because they were staying in one place. On here, there's a lot. You need to know all the terms on this page, and there are many. Rangeland, that's where animals graze. Cropland, that's where fruits and vegetables are grown. Soil, we've talked about in class. It's more than dirt. It is the weathered rock fragments, the bacteria, the fungi, the bugs, the worms, the decomposed matter, all of that kind of stuff together makes soil. You should know the term monoculture. That means only one thing is being grown, versus polyculture, where many things are being grown. You should know traditional agriculture. So traditional agriculture, talked about up there, is basically what people did for the 10,000 years since we started agriculture till about the 1950s. You should know what sustainable agriculture is, and then what industrial agriculture is. So industrial agriculture is what kind of rose up in the 1940s and 50s right here. And this happened because of a lot of technological advances that allowed people to grow more crops on less land, and therefore grow, instead of subsistence agriculture, which is just growing what you need to eat, people were actually able to grow more than they needed, and they could sell it for cash. And so agriculture actually became a money-making business at that point. Sustainable agriculture is a movement where people are growing food in a way that doesn't deplete the resources in the land that it's grown on. There's another term over here that I kind of defined that isn't in the book, but you should know, and it's this idea of plantation agriculture. And this is where large corporations or governments or individual wealthy families from wealthy countries have big farms in developing countries for cash crops. So this has been going on for several hundred years. You can think about the sugar plantations in the West Indies. You think about the cotton plantations in the South. Coffee, tea, and bananas, those are currently going on to this day. Coffee is grown in Central and South America, parts of Africa. Tea is grown in India and Sri Lanka and a couple places around there. Bananas throughout Central and South America. These, they make money, and so people want to grow them. A lot of these places have human rights violations and unfair labor practices. So it's considered, something that we would like to get rid of. And then one more thing that you should know about farming and agriculture is that it is considered that there is no more arable land available in the world. And arable means able to be farmed. And the reason for that is there's land, but maybe the soil is not good, or it doesn't have access to water, or the soil has become salinized, or any number of things. But pretty much people think that we are farming all the land that is currently available to farm. Then when you turn the page, you get to soil, the foundation of agriculture. This is section 9.2. So you should know that soil is a complex system of organic and inorganic parts. We've talked about that before. There's a picture here that kind of shows you just all sorts of things that are living under the ground in a sample of soil. And then on this page, you should know this picture and caption. It shows you the plant roots going down into the soil, and then it shows you how nitrogen and phosphorus are needed in the roots, and that the nutrients go into the plant through the roots in the soil. You need to know soil formation and types of weathering. So we've talked about that, physical, chemical, and biological weathering, and then comes from the parent material, which is the bedrock. There is this term here, humus. It's not hummus like you eat, but humus. And this is an important component to healthy soil. So it acts like a buffer in the soil for the pH. It can promote microorganisms like bacteria and fungi and things like that maintain the healthy soil. It prevents nutrients from leaching out of the soil through water runoff. And I have down here no leaching and soil profile. Leaching is where solid particles get dissolved or suspended in liquid, and then when it runs through the soil, it gets transported away. So it's leached off. It's pulled away from it. And so humus prevents that from happening. Okay, try to get all of this in here. All right, so here we have a soil profile. That's what it's called when you look at like a cross section of the soil. And it's got all these different layers. You don't need to know all of them. You don't need to know E, you don't need to know R in the book. You need to know O, A, B, and C. So the O horizon is here at the top. It's the organic layer, O for organic. The A horizon, I don't know what the A stands for there, but it's the topsoil here. And then the B horizon is the subsoil underneath that. And the C horizon is the weathered parent material. And underneath that is rock. That's all that the R stands for. But you need to know those, and you need to know what's in them. You need to know like them in order and what they contain. And then in this section, it talks a lot about soil properties, color, texture, pH, structure, all of these sorts of things. And then a couple that aren't really mentioned by name, but we've talked about and you need to know, the idea of porosity. This is the amount of water that a soil can hold, or its pore size and space. Clay and sand are the least porous. They have the least porosity. Sand is the number one least, okay? Silt and loam have the most porosity. And then we talked about permeability. And this is like the drainage rate of the soil, how fast the soil drains. If it is too high, the roots don't get enough water. So the water runs through it so quickly that the roots can't absorb any water. But if it's too low, the soil becomes waterlogged, which is a term you need to know. And that can lead to root rot, which means that the soil, it just gets mushy and the plant will die. You also need to know this term. AP exam likes this term for some reason. It's plowpan. And this is just a hard layer in the soil that resists water drainage. So it could be clay, it could be rock or whatever, but it prevents the water from draining. And then again, that can lead to the root rot. You should know the particle sizes, and you should know what loam is. Loam is the best soil because it's made up of a fairly equal mix of the different particles. So clay is tiny, silt is medium sized, and then look, sand is huge in comparison. So these are like relatively to scale in terms of how big the particles are compared to each other. So there are physical soil tests that you can do. We talked about soil sieves. These are just filters that people use, and they separate the soil by particle size. So like if you think about a big hole, these two would pass through and this one would get stuck. And then in the next layer, the clay would pass through, but the silt wouldn't. And so you would have all of your particles sort of sorted by size. And then you use this soil triangle to ID what type of soil you have. Another term on this page that you need to know, I highlighted up here, it's not bold, it's Swidden agriculture. And this is sort of something, it's a traditional form of agriculture in tropical areas where people move to a place They farm for a while, and then the soil becomes depleted and they move on. Remember, we talked about how tropical rainforests actually don't have very fertile soil because the nutrients are all used up. So they'll plant for a little while and move on. Another thing that they do is this slash and burn, which is like Swidden agriculture, but a specific type. They'll cut down all the trees, they'll burn them, and then they'll mix the ash into the soil so that the nutrients are there. And then when the nutrients are depleted, they'll move on. And this works when there's not a large amount of people to, do this. When there's just a few people, the forest could kind of grow up behind them. And then by the time they came back around there, the forest would be back. But now that there's so many people, it just doesn't work anymore. All right, again, we have another full section here. On this page is talking about irrigating crops, and you should know what irrigation is. That just means that you are adding water to your cropland, like if you think about the sprinkler in your yard. So you need to know the types of irrigation. This one talks about flood and furrow. This is center pivot. Over here, this is conventional irrigation. You see this a lot in fields around here. And then drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is one that you really need to know. It's important in a lot of ways, but the idea is that there are little holes in this sort of hose that you run through the crops, and it just drips a little at a time. And so it doesn't get waterlogged, and the water goes directly to the plant root. Whereas if you look at this, I mean, so much of it is evaporating before it even hits the ground, and it's landing on spaces that aren't cropland. And so only about 40% of that water actually gets to the plant. And then in flood and furrow, if you see these giant furrows here, so much of that evaporates. So all of those are kind of wasteful, and this is the best. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. In irrigation, water can evaporate. When it evaporates, it can leave behind salts. Doesn't taste like there's salt in it. There's very, very tiny amounts of salt. But over time, a buildup of those salts will prevent the germination and growth of plants. And that is called salinization, which is a term right here that you should know. Mitigation. So mitigation means to fix a problem after it's occurred. So how can we mitigate salinization? One of the ways is that we can flush the soil with fresh water. But that only works if you have a lot of fresh water available, which a lot of places don't have. That's why they got salinized in the first place, because they had to irrigate. You can also plant salt-tolerant plants. An example of that is barley, and there are other types, and they will help to draw the salt out of the soil. There is prevention, which is always better than mitigation. Prevention